Welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next. If you're not too careful, you just might learn something.
The best investment you can ever make if you're working on any of these trucks is a topside creeper, worth every penny. Again, you always want to be careful, just in case, any of this plastic is brittle. We don't want to break anything. It has a retainer lock on it that you have to be careful about. It can be a little tricky to get off because you can't see underneath there exactly how this unlocks unless you're familiar with it. But this little red locking clip has to be pulled back, and you have to depress that to get it off. I haven't even looked at the air filter yet, so I have no idea what that looks like. Now, the fellow supposedly takes pretty good care of his stuff, so let's see what that air filter looks like. Ew. Yeah, I think we're gonna find him another one of those. Now that we got the fan shroud and all out of the way, so we can get our wrench in there to turn the crank a little bit easier. Now there's other ways to do that, just as there are other ways to get the starter out. You could also take the oil filter adapter out first, and then you can drop the starter out through the bottom. Either way, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Anyway, at this point, we're going to go ahead and remove the oil filter adapter off the side of the upper oil pan. And that'll get us better access to a little rubbery kind of cover thing that we need to take out so we can get access to the torque converter bolts. Now, first, of course, I'm going to remove this oil filter, and then we'll also have these 2 electrical connectors that we're going to have to take off and get those out of the way. And let's go ahead and get that oil filter out of there. This is going to be messy. Gotta love all that nice yucky diesel oil. Now, you don your gloves or your rag or whatever, you're best off just to go ahead and, twist this thing off of here, because it'll drain like that forever. And just get it over with. If you want to let the majority of it run out, you can do that. And let that just drain into the drain pan there for a bit. While that's doing its thing, we'll go ahead and get our electrical connectors off of here. You gotta watch, make sure if they've got locks on them like that does, prevent them from just vibrating off on their own. Now this one doesn't look like it has one. All right, let's tuck that up out of the way. And you're going to have 4 8mm bolts And you're going to have one 10mm stud with a 10mm nut on the top that also holds a bracket that holds on to the starter wiring harness. So I'm going to run the rest of these bolts out and show you what we got when we're done. So this is your oil filter adapter, and these are the 5 bolts, or 4 bolts and 1 stud. And always make sure you go ahead and get your new O-rings, and well, this is like an O-ring style gasket. Don't ever reuse the old stuff. That's just dumb. Now let's see if we can get this transmission out of here. Oh, it's gonna be fun. To get this cable off right here, what we'll need to do is unlock it like so. Pop that on up like so. When you're taking this thing out, you have this clip right here that you gently pry under here with a screwdriver and pop it back, and then very gently pry behind this to get it to pop off of the selector lever. But be careful, because that is plastic, and if it's perished, it could break on you. And then you got 2 13mm headed bolts up here that hold the bracket for the cable on. I go ahead and take those out. Now I'm just going to put the bolts back in the holes here so I know where they go. They have a little Loctite on them, so be ready for that. They'll fight you on the way out. Then of course you got your electrical connector here, which is kind of a twist as you pull kind of thing. And again, it's plastic, so you want to be careful with that and look and see that it's dry and there's not a bunch of transmission fluid in there. This one's good. And then we'll have to do the same thing pretty much with the transfer case. Next thing we're going to do is we'll go ahead and we'll get that transfer case cable disconnected, and then we'll take our front drive shaft and rear drive shaft loose. To get this front drive shaft off, these are going to be a 12mm 12-point. So that means you got to use a wrench like that. It's got 12 sides on it. And you're going to get it on there, and you're going to find out just how rubbery some wrenches can feel. And you're going to have to put a piece of pipe on it. I know that's not exactly orthodox, but there's not enough room to get a ratchet in there or a big 1/2-inch drive. So, but just a gentle tug, it will come loose. So I would say that qualifies as tight as shit and then some. Now, the other bit here, I have the drive shaft propped or locked with a pry bar right in there. So that holds it steady while I'm wrenching on that bolt in the back. Now this is where a ratcheting box wrench really comes in handy. So you can get it in there and it just make this process a whole lot quicker. And these obviously have Loctite on them because they're fighting me. So I'll make sure that I Loctite them when I go back in with them. Being an F550, I mean, this thing's a beast. Everything's just freaking huge on this. Now, we want to go ahead and make sure we get our transmission jack positioned under here. And you want to go as far to the back as you possibly can, because you've got that big heavy transfer case hanging off the back end, and get some support under it. Then I'll go ahead, I haven't pulled the rear drive shaft yet, we'll pull that, and then we'll support it and get the lower cross member out so we can lower it down just enough where we can get a strap over the front half of this transmission just to hold it down here. It's always a good idea to tie that thing down, because it's going to be a very wonky, unbalanced load. And you may have to get creative in your adjustments to make sure that, you know, your legs are hitting the transmission evenly around on all four corners. So just be ready for that, because this has got an odd shaped pan. So I'm gonna give it just a tiny bit, just to snug it up against that pan, and then we'll loosen up our transmission mounts and then take out this little cross member section here. Get that out of the way, make sure you don't have any cables attached to it and that sort of thing. It helps, since you've got all your linkages disconnected, to go ahead and put the transmission in park. That way you're not worried about trying to hold the drive shaft in place. And that'll let you get the bolts loose. And what I'm using here is a short 10mm 12 point, because that just happens to be the 12 point that I have, and a short extension. And these also have Loctite on them, just FYI. And you'll want to wrap some tape around the U-joints. Once we get this transmission out of here, out of the way, then it will make it a lot easier to remove the exhaust, the section of exhaust that I have to take out to get the section with the DPF and all out of here so I can clean it up. Thankfully, during this week, we're going to have some a little bit nicer weather, so I can actually use my pressure washer to clean all the oil spooge off of this thing. So ideally, that's the best way to do it. And don't ever take this kind of work to a car wash. They get really upset. I'll soak this down with like a biodegradable degreaser, and then hose it off that way. We'll tape this up really, really good, because we don't want these cups falling off of here, because if they fall off and you don't get them put back just exactly right, then you're going to be replacing a U-joint. Now it's time. We'll go ahead and pull these rear transmission crossmember mounts out. That one's going to be a 21mm or 13/16 if you don't happen to have one. There we go. And if you got a good oil leak going on, it's going to be messy. Then, for the cross member, I'm going to take and just take the weight off of it. So you're going to have an 18mm on the bolt head side. And And then the nut is going to be a 19. You're not going to have room to get on the nut side with the impact, so you got to run it out from the bolt head side. And these are locking nuts, so they will fight you all the way out, of course. And as a safety precaution, you know, leave the bolts in until you got them all loose. And before you do this, always make sure you double check it's a good time to check your transmission and make sure you got all the lines and everything disconnected and wires from it and all that. And since you don't have any weight on the cross member, these bolts should ought to come out pretty easy. And also, be aware that this cross member is going to be heavy. This is an F550 after all. All right, ooh, nice and yucky. You know, I'm gonna have to add a rating to my videos and call it the yuck factor. And that's for all the grease and spooge you're gonna encounter during the job. I'd call this one a yuck factor 9. And now we can lower our transmission down just a little bit. We need to get a strap over the bell housing here to tie this thing down for safety. And you're gonna have to do it by feel, because you're not really gonna be able to see much up there, but you'll feel where those two fuel lines are, and then you can work your strap underneath them. You don't want to put your strap over them. And to do it, you may have to pull some slack over top of the fuel lines for now, and then go to the back of the transmission to get underneath the lines, and then work the strap back forward. Pray that you don't have the PTO on here. The torque shift comes with an optional power takeoff unit. That would add another step to the process, because you would have to remove that PTO first and get it out of the way before you can do any of this. But again, as I said, never skip that step, because once you undo these bell housing bolts, the whole balance changes and it's going to be back heavy. And this torque shift 6-speed by itself is immensely heavy. So then you throw that transfer case on the back, and it being a F550, you know, it's massive. So now we go and we take our bell housing bolts out. You know, it's always a good idea too at this juncture, before you pull your bell housing bolts out, which right now are the last things holding that transmission transfer case to the motor. Take a look around and make sure you got everything undone. You know, your filler tube, your transmission cooler lines, any wires, brackets that may be attached to something that's attached to the transmission, that sort of thing. Now, you wouldn't want to make that mistake and then go to pull the tranny and then realize you're tearing up your cooler lines or something like that. Now, since I never make mistakes, I don't have to worry about it. Now here comes the magic moment where we get this joker out of here, and you'll have to pick it back up a bit to get it to come off the transmission smoothly. And you're going to notice too that when you loosen the bell housing bolts, you're probably going to get a bunch of oil come running out of the bell housing, and that's because the inside of the bell housing got full of oil from all that leakage going on. And then just very gently work it back. It should come apart smoothly. You don't want to force anything. And always be mindful of your surroundings. You know, I've got this truck, I've got stands supporting the back of this truck because that's the way it'll go if it gets too light, because the bed, this is a long bed chassis cab, or a long frame chassis cab, and you got that monster rear end hanging way the hell out the back end there. So if it goes, it's going to tip back. So I've got a big heavy duty stand there just in case. I don't want to end up on TikTok somewhere with a video of my lift or my truck falling off the lift. We don't want to do that. And you want it to come apart smooth. You don't want to force anything. Gonna have to get past those dowel pins to get free of the engine. There we go. And she's really gonna, that transmission's really gonna try and lean back on you because you got all that weight of that transfer case hanging off the back end. Once we're clear, and you gotta pull it back to get away from the torque converter, get it out of the flywheel. And of course, you're gonna hit on the back of the cab here. It's just gonna be a delicate dance of down and back. There we go. But just work her down real gentle, and then do just a little bit of down and back. And never stay in one place while you're letting your transmission down or on one side. You always go back and forth and check everything, because you don't want it hanging on the way down on something and then tipping back on you, and then you got a problem. All right, now we've got a drain pan there. We'll go ahead and just scooch that forward out of the way. It seems like we've got it fairly well balanced. This thing is a monster beast of a transmission. I'm here to tell you. especially with this transfer case hanging out the back of it. And as I said, we don't necessarily have to roll the thing completely out from under the truck. We can just scooch it back far enough to get out of our way. All right. That warrants a celebratory cold one, I think. Now, we got our transmission out of here. I'll take the little camcorder and go under here and show you some stuff. One thing that you have to make exceptionally sure of is that when you go to put this thing back together, you clean that bell housing out because it's collected a lot of oil. And when it goes down the road, you'll have a what appears to be an oil leak. And we don't want that. Now, it's time we got to take the flywheel off there, and that's going to require an 18 millimeter 12-point half-inch socket. And we want to be careful taking it off because there's a crank sensor in there. So let's get cracking with that. The other thing you have to be careful of too is this flywheel only goes on one way. So there is an index hole, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my index mark here right where I indexed that torque converter bolt or that stud. So I'll line everything back up. I'm gonna run out of hands here. Now you've also got a little reinforcing ring on here too. You want to be very, very careful when you take this off. Because you don't want to disturb or damage that crankshaft sensor that's behind it. The rear main seal is built into the back side here. And what we're seeing here, what you might think is a rear main seal, is actually a magnetic ring. Then the actual crank seal is behind that, but I'm seeing some spooge here. And I don't know if that's oil or not, but you can damn well better believe we're going to check that before we throw this thing back together.